November 1943, the sky above Rabaul looked like a second sun. 1,000 explosions reflected off the harbor as Japan's fortress of the South Seas burned itself alive. Within hours, hundreds of aircraft were destroyed and over 100,000 men trapped. The Empire's greatest stronghold had become its tomb. What happened here wasn't just military defeat. It was pride, punished by physics. Tonight, we uncover how arrogance, not bombs, destroyed Japan's invincible fortress. Stay to the end and subscribe for more forgotten turning points from World War II. January 1942. The smoke of Pearl Harbor still lingered across the Pacific when Japan seized a small volcanic island called Rabaul. To the Imperial High Command, this wasn't just a conquest. It was the foundation of a dream. They envisioned a southern stronghold so vast and impregnable that no enemy could ever breach it. Within months, the island was transformed from a tropical outpost into the most fortified position in the Pacific. Volcanic ridges were carved into bunkers and tunnels that could hide tanks, hospitals, and ammunition for months. 6 sprawling airfields cut through the jungle like veins of steel. Massive concrete runways stretched across what had once been quiet coastal villages. Every mountain became a fortress, every harbor a launch pad for expansion. Over 100,000 men poured into the island. Engineers, pilots, naval crews, and soldiers of the 8th Area Army under General Hitoshi Imamura, and the 11th Air Fleet under Admiral Junichi Kusaka. The two commanders, fierce believers in Japan's divine mission, turned Rabaul into a living symbol of imperial might. The harbor filled with cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Convoys streamed in day and night, unloading fuel, artillery, aircraft, and food supplies from across the empire. To visiting officers, it looked like Tokyo's industrial heart transplanted into the jungle. The locals watched in silence as entire hills vanished beneath the drills and explosions of Japanese engineers. Tunnels stretched for miles, connecting command posts, hospitals, and storage depots deep underground. Overhead, anti-aircraft guns crowned every ridge. Even nature seemed subdued under the weight of ambition. From the sky, Rabaul glittered like a steel bloom rising from the Pacific. Impenetrable, unstoppable, eternal. The Empire called it the Fortress of the South Seas. To the Japanese High Command, it represented security. To the Americans who studied reconnaissance photos from far away, it represented opportunity. Because in fortifying Rabaul so heavily, Japan had done something it would never recover from. It had put all its power in one place. By mid-1942, Rabaul had become the beating heart of Japan's southern empire, a fortress that projected power across thousands of miles of ocean. From its 6 airfields, Zero fighters and Betty bombers fanned out daily, striking Allied convoys, sinking supply ships, and harassing outposts from New Guinea to the Solomons. The Japanese called it the Southern Shield. From Tokyo's perspective, it was proof that their empire was eternal, a shining symbol that the Imperial Army and Navy could defend anything they conquered. Pilots trained beneath banners proclaiming, "The fortress will not fall." Rabaul was the nerve center of operations, stretching from Borneo to the Coral Sea. General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka worked side by side, convinced they had built something untouchable. To them, geography itself was a weapon. Rabaul's natural harbor, surrounded by steep ridges and volcanic peaks, created the illusion of safety. Concrete bunkers tunneled deep into the rock-shielded command posts from air raids. Anti-aircraft batteries covered every hilltop. Every gun that could be moved south was moved here. Every bomber within range called Rabaul home. It was a city of war, alive day and night with engines, drills, and marching boots. But even as Rabaul's power reached its zenith, cracks had already begun to show. The Americans were learning to fight differently. Instead of attacking fortified islands head-on, they began isolating them, starving them of supplies, fuel, and reinforcements. New long-range bombers were mapping Rabaul's defenses from the edge of the horizon, and every ship that entered the harbor was silently logged by U.S. submarines. The Empire's fortress was under surveillance it didn't know existed. Rabaul's commanders couldn't see the shift happening beneath their own pride. Every new anti-air gun they installed, every bunker they built, made them believe more deeply in the myth of invincibility. To the Americans, however, this fortress wasn't a threat. It was bait. Japan had gathered everything it valued most into one perfect target. By the autumn of 1943, the tide of war had already begun to turn against Japan. But inside the command tunnels of Rabaul, reality was still a foreign concept. Reports from New Guinea told of Allied advances creeping ever closer, yet General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka refused to believe the Americans could reach their prized fortress. Their answer was not to disperse, but to concentrate. They ordered every available aircraft in the region to fly to Rabaul. Over 500 planes, from nimble Zero fighters to lumbering Betty bombers and Val dive bombers. They lined the airfields wing to wing, runway to runway, creating what they thought was an unbeatable aerial wall. The idea was simple: crush any American invasion before it began. With such overwhelming air strength gathered in one place, the Japanese believed no fleet could approach within 100 miles of Rabaul without being annihilated. Officers toasted to the Empire's foresight. Pilots spoke of dying with glory beneath the Emperor's flag. On paper, it was brilliance. In reality, it was suicide. The dense concentration of planes turned the airfields into powder kegs. One spark, one bomb, one strafing run could ignite hundreds of machines at once. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Allied intelligence officers examined aerial photographs that revealed every inch of Rabaul's defenses. Long rows of aircraft, barely camouflaged. Fuel dumps sitting out in the open. Cargo ships packed shoulder to shoulder in the harbor. Every mistake was visible from the sky. U.S. planners didn't have to guess where to strike. The Japanese had practically drawn them a map. Still, Imamura dismissed warnings from subordinates who feared an air raid. The Americans, he insisted, cannot reach Rabaul. Their range is too short. It was a fatal assumption. Technology had already outpaced his understanding of war. The new American F-6F Hellcats and TBF Avengers, flying from distant carriers, could cross more than 1,000 kilometers. Farther, faster, and heavier than anything Japan had prepared for. What Imamura saw as security, the Americans saw as the perfect opportunity. Rabaul wasn't just a fortress anymore. It was a waiting inferno. By late October 1943, Rabaul looked unstoppable on paper. 6 airfields, hundreds of planes, and one of the most heavily armed harbors in the Pacific. But in truth, the fortress was blind. Its early warning systems, the primitive Type II Mark I radars, were relics, short-ranged, unreliable, and useless in the violent tropical storms that rolled across the island almost daily. The radar screens flickered with static more often than they showed enemy movement. When they did detect incoming aircraft, the warning often came too late for pilots to scramble. Japan's most powerful airbase was flying half-blind, relying on human eyesight in skies already owned by American reconnaissance. Worse still, the Imperial Army and Navy refused to cooperate. Imamura's army command operated on one frequency, Kusaka's naval staff on another. There was no shared network, no joint coordination center, and no unified command structure. It was as if two separate wars were being fought from the same island, each with its own priorities, each hoarding information. When American B-24s or Catalinas appeared over the horizon, both commands issued conflicting orders. Pilots lifted off without direction, wasting precious fuel chasing shadows across the clouds. The Americans, by contrast, had perfected the art of information warfare. PBY Catalinas and Liberator bombers patrolled Rabaul's skies daily, photographing every dock, runway, and fuel tank. Submarines lingered off the coast, recording shipping movements and transmitting them to Allied carriers hundreds of miles away. Even from the air, they could see Japan's overconfidence. Entire squadrons of Zero fighters were parked in neat lines, fuel barrels stacked beside them, anti-aircraft guns unmanned during daylight hours. Inside their bunkers, Imamura and Kusaka still believed in the myth of invincibility. But from Admiral Halsey's carriers to General Kenny's airfields in the Solomons, one phrase kept circulating among Allied pilots: "Rabaul can't see us coming." That simple truth would soon ignite one of the most devastating air assaults of the entire Pacific War. The fortress that thought it could see forever was about to be struck by an enemy it never even glimpsed. At dawn on November 2nd, 1943, the calm over Rabaul shattered. 5 American carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Princeton, and Independence, launched 349 aircraft into the humid Pacific air. They flew low, tight, and silent, racing toward an enemy that still believed they were out of reach. Japanese radar picked up only fragments of static. By the time the alarm sounded, the first wave of Avengers and Hellcats was already breaking through the clouds. On the ground, pilots scrambled, mechanics shouted, and anti-aircraft guns roared to life too late. The first bombs hit the main airfield like thunder. Fuel tanks exploded, sending fireballs hundreds of feet into the air. Hangars vanished in blinding light. Pilots sprinting toward their planes were thrown to the ground as shock waves rolled across the runways. Aircraft parked wing to wing ignited in chain reactions, one burning Zero setting off the next, then the next, until the entire field became a storm of fire and twisted metal. Within minutes, the smell of burning fuel and scorched flesh blanketed the island. Japanese pilots who managed to take off found themselves flying into chaos. The Americans were everywhere. Hellcats cutting through the sky in tight formations, Avengers diving through smoke to drop their payloads with terrifying precision. The Japanese counterattack collapsed before it even began. Some Zeros fought valiantly, clawing into dogfights they couldn't win. The new American planes could dive faster, climb steeper, and absorb hits that would tear a Zero apart. Below, Admiral Kusaka watched from his command post as black smoke rose from the harbor. Ships burned where they were anchored. The once proud fleet shimmered in the orange glow of destruction. After just 90 minutes, the raid was over. More than 100 Japanese aircraft were gone, destroyed or crippled before they ever left the ground. That night, Imamura gathered his officers and insisted the damage was temporary. But the truth was undeniable. Rabaul's defenses were broken. The Americans had proven they could strike the fortress at will, and they were only getting started. The bombs had stopped falling, but Rabaul was already dying from within. The Americans didn't need to destroy it overnight. They just had to choke it. By November 1943, U.S. submarines prowled every approach to the island. sinking merchant ships and fuel convoys before they could reach the harbor. The once bustling docks where engineers unloaded food, ammunition, and oil now stood empty. Supply drums rusted in the rain, rats gnawed on what little rice remained, and men who had once served proudly under the rising sun now counted grains by the handful. Without fuel, planes couldn't fly. Without spare parts, engines rusted in silence. Mechanics began dismantling wrecked aircraft just to keep a few in the air, scavenging bolts, propellers, and metal sheets from the burned-out skeletons of Zeros. Pilots slept beside their grounded planes, their faces hollowed by malaria and hunger. Every sortie meant one less aircraft that would ever return. The jungle itself turned against them. Torrential rain flooded tunnels, washing out ammunition bunkers and food caches. Mosquitoes swarmed so thick that soldiers covered their mouths to breathe. Malaria spread uncontrollably, followed by dysentery and tropical ulcers that devoured flesh down to the bone. Medical supplies were gone, and the only medicine left was hope. Many soldiers began to die quietly in their bunks, unburied, their names unrecorded. General Imamura sent desperate pleas to Tokyo, begging for reinforcements and resupply. None came. Japan's navy was stretched thin, and every ship sent to Rabaul risked destruction by Allied bombers waiting beyond the horizon. The imperial fortress, once the pride of the Pacific, had become a prison. Meanwhile, the Americans grew stronger by the day. Fresh planes arrived weekly at Bougainville and the Solomons, their crews fed, rested, and ready. Each raid grew larger, more precise, more confident. Rabaul, starved of strength and blinded by arrogance, could only wait for the next strike. The fortress that once promised victory was now living on borrowed time. November 5th, 1943. The morning began with silence, heavy, unnatural, almost sacred. Then came the hum, faint at first, like the vibration of distant thunder. It grew louder, deeper, until the very air trembled. From beyond the horizon, the U.S. carriers Saratoga and Princeton unleashed over 200 aircraft. The clouds above Rabaul split open as Hellcats, Avengers, and dauntless dive bombers poured through in perfect formation. Sunlight glinted off their wings, turning the sky into a wall of steel and fire. The sirens wailed too late. Ground crews ran for cover, shouting warnings drowned out by the scream of engines. The first bombs struck the main runway, then the oil tanks, then the hangars. Each explosion tore through the airfields with merciless precision. Flames rolled across the ground like living creatures. Zeros still lined up wing to wing became torches. Pilots trying to take off were blown apart before their wheels left the ground. Above, the dogfights were short and brutal. Japanese pilots, some half-starved and exhausted, threw their planes into the storm with the same courage that had once terrified the Pacific. But they were outmatched. The F-6F Hellcat turned tighter, dove faster, and could absorb bullets that would shred a Zero to ribbons. "They're burning! The whole base is burning," one American pilot radioed as tracer fire streaked across the clouds. Below, the harbor became hell itself. Bombs slammed into the heavy cruisers Otago, Maya, and Takao, each one a pillar of Japan's naval pride. Flames leapt hundreds of feet high as secondary explosions tore through ammunition stores. The water boiled with oil and debris. A Japanese sailor later wrote, "The air smelled of burning iron and blood." The island itself seemed to scream. By noon, the fortress was unrecognizable. Ships listed in the shallows. Aircraft lay shattered like broken wings. The sky above Rabaul glowed orange with fire and smoke, the deathlight of an empire. The fortress of the South Seas had fallen not to invasion, but to the sky itself. 6 days later, Rabaul's nightmare began again. At dawn on November 11th, 1943, the horizon filled with specks, hundreds of them, growing larger every second. This time, the Americans came with everything they had. The carriers Essex, Bunker Hill, Independence, and Yorktown unleashed more than 500 aircraft, a storm of steel and vengeance sweeping toward the crippled fortress. The defenders barely stirred. Radar screens were dead, communication lines severed, and half the surviving pilots too weak to fly. Anti-aircraft guns fired sporadically, but most had no shells left to load. The first wave struck like the fist of God. Bombs rained across every airfield, runway, and bunker. Warehouses detonated one after another, turning the harbor into a chain of erupting volcanoes. Columns of flame shot thousands of feet into the sky, visible from ships over 60 miles away. Oil storage tanks burst open, spilling fire across the sea. The ground quaked. The sun vanished behind a canopy of black smoke and drifting ash. A lone mechanic trying to reach his aircraft was thrown flat by a blast. When he rose, the plane was gone, replaced by a smoking crater. Pilots trapped in underground shelters felt the oxygen burn away as fire sucked the air from their lungs. Admiral Kusaka listened in his bunker as the last messages crackled through dying radios. Runway gone, fuel gone, communications dead. And then, silence. When the final wave pulled away, Rabaul was a furnace. Ships lay crippled in Simpson Harbor, flames crawling up their hulls. The once great airfields were nothing but scorched earth. More than 100 Japanese aircraft were gone. The Americans lost fewer than 20. That night, sailors aboard U.S. destroyers miles offshore watched the horizon glowing red for hours. One described it as a volcano made of metal. Rabaul, the so-called invincible fortress, had become a pyre. Its pride burned to cinders. The fortress of Japan was gone. All that remained was smoke, silence, and the smell of defeat drifting across the Pacific. When the smoke finally cleared, Rabaul was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. The airfields were cratered wastelands, the harbor choked with the twisted hulks of once proud warships. The fires smoldered for days, painting the night sky blood red. For the 100,000 Japanese troops still trapped there, the war outside had moved on. There would be no rescue, no resupply, and no escape. Admiral Kusaka ordered what ships remained to flee toward Truk, abandoning the garrison to starvation and disease. The fortress of the South Seas, once hailed as impregnable, had been sealed by its own arrogance. Life within the ruins became a slow death. Food was gone. Malaria and dysentery spread unchecked. Soldiers scavenged in the jungle for roots and insects, carving ration logs into bamboo so they could remember what they had eaten. Some wrote letters to families that would never be delivered. One pilot who survived the bombardment scribbled a haunting line in his diary. "We did not die from American bombs. We died from Japanese pride." By early 1944, the once feared 11th Air Fleet had withered into silence. Its planes sat gutted and rusting on their runways, their aluminum skin peeling away under the tropical sun. The men who had once vowed to defend the island to the death now guarded ghosts. When Australian troops finally entered Rabaul in 1945, they found thousands of soldiers still at their posts, thin, sick, but obedient, waiting for orders that would never come. Today, the jungle has swallowed most of what remains. Vines creep through tunnels where officers once shouted commands. 0 fighters lie half-buried beneath moss, their wings warped like bones. On one surviving bunker wall, a message remains scratched into the concrete by an unknown hand. We believed too much. History remembers Rabaul as Japan's greatest fortress, but its legacy is something darker, a monument to overconfidence, to the blindness of command, and to what happens when pride stands where wisdom should. Not every fortress falls to enemy fire. Some collapse from within. Rabaul did both, burned from above, hollowed from inside. The day belief outlived reality.